Picture this. It's 3 in the morning in medieval Europe, and while most of the world sleeps, a group of nuns quietly moves through dimly lit corridors toward their brewery. These women aren't just making beer for sustenance. They're practicing what we might recognize today as occupational therapy, mindfulness, meditation, and community healing, all wrapped up in the sacred act of brewing. What if I told you that some of the most innovative therapeutic practices in human history happened not in modern hospitals or therapy centers, but in the brewing halls of medieval convents? Welcome back to the channel where we explore the hidden stories that shaped our world. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating that most people have never heard about: how medieval nuns turned brewing into one of the most sophisticated forms of therapy ever developed. Centuries before we had words like psychology or mental health treatment. Now I know what you're thinking. Nuns and beer. That seems like a contradiction. But trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to see medieval convents in a completely different light. And you might even recognize some therapeutic techniques that we're just rediscovering today. Let me start with something that's going to blow your mind. In medieval times, beer wasn't just an alcoholic beverage. It was literally safer to drink than water. The brewing process killed harmful bacteria that contaminated most water sources, making beer a daily necessity for survival. But here's where it gets interesting. While most brewing was done by men in commercial settings, convents developed something entirely unique. These religious communities didn't just brew for sustenance. They created what we can only describe as therapeutic brewing programs that addressed physical, mental, and spiritual wellness in ways that were revolutionary for their time. The nuns understood something profound about the connection between meaningful work, community, and healing that we're only beginning to rediscover in modern therapy. Let's talk about the daily rhythm first, because this is where the therapeutic magic really begins. Medieval convent life was structured around prayer times, called the canonical hours. But between these spiritual obligations, the nuns engaged in what they called laborare, sacred work. Brewing became one of the most important forms of this sacred labor. And here's why that's so significant. The brewing process itself required what we now recognize as essential therapeutic elements. First, there was routine and structure. Every batch followed the same careful steps, performed at the same times, creating a predictable framework that provided psychological stability. The nuns would rise before dawn, not just for morning prayers, but to tend to their fermenting vessels, checking temperatures and adjusting conditions with a kind of mindful attention that modern therapists try to teach their patients. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The sensory aspects of brewing created what we now know as grounding techniques. Think about it. The warmth of the brewing vessels against cold stone walls. The rich aromas of malting grain. The bubbling sounds of active fermentation. These nuns were engaging all five senses in a process that naturally anchored them in the present moment. They were practicing mindfulness meditation without even knowing that's what it was called. The tactile experience was particularly important. Kneading and mixing ingredients, feeling the grain between their fingers, monitoring the texture of the developing brew. All of this provided the kind of sensory input that we now know helps regulate the nervous system. Many of these women had experienced trauma, whether from family rejection, economic hardship, or the general brutality of medieval life. The repetitive, nurturing motions of brewing gave them a way to literally work through their pain with their hands. Now, let's dive into the community aspect, because this is where convent brewing becomes even more therapeutically sophisticated. These weren't individual endeavors. Brewing was a collective activity that created what modern psychologists call social scaffolding. Older, experienced nuns worked alongside newcomers, creating mentorship relationships that provided both practical skills and emotional support. The brewing schedule naturally created opportunities for what we now call peer counseling. While waiting for grains to steep or fermentation to progress, the nuns would share stories, offer advice, and provide emotional support to one another. They developed informal networks of care that addressed everything from homesickness to spiritual doubt to physical ailments. The brewery became a space where vulnerability was not only accepted but encouraged as part of the sacred process. Here's something particularly striking. Many convents developed specialized roles within their brewing operations that seemed to naturally match different personality types and therapeutic needs. Some nuns became expert at the precise timing required for different stages, developing skills that boosted their confidence and sense of purpose. Others excelled at quality control, learning to trust their senses and judgment in ways that built self-esteem. Still others became teachers, finding healing through helping newcomers master the craft. The abbesses who oversaw these operations understood something profound about matching tasks to individual needs. A nun struggling with anxiety might be given responsibility for the careful monitoring, tasks that required steady attention and created a sense of control. Someone dealing with depression might be assigned to work with others on collaborative aspects that provided social connection and shared purpose. Without modern diagnostic categories, these women were practicing individualized therapeutic interventions. Let me share something that really drives this home. The surviving records from several medieval convents show that brewing days had significantly lower rates of what they called melancholia and spiritual disturbance compared to other activities. The nuns themselves recognized that brewing had a uniquely positive effect on their emotional and spiritual well-being, even if they didn't have modern language to explain why. The seasonal rhythms of brewing also provided what we now understand as essential therapeutic structure. Spring brought the excitement of new ingredients and fresh starts. Summer required careful attention to temperature, control, and preservation techniques. Fall was harvest time, creating a sense of abundance and gratitude. Winter brewing focused on hardier, warming varieties that provided comfort during the darkest months. This natural cycle gave the nuns' lives meaning and anticipation, combating the seasonal depression that affected so many medieval communities. Now here's where the story gets really interesting from a historical perspective. These convent breweries weren't operating in isolation. They were often the primary suppliers of beer for their surrounding communities, which meant the nuns were engaged in meaningful economic activity that connected them to the broader world. This external validation of their skills created what psychologists now call mastery experiences, concrete evidence of competence and value that builds self-esteem and resilience. The quality of convent brewed beer became legendary in many regions. Unlike commercial brewers who were primarily focused on profit, the nuns could afford to take time with their processes, experiment with new techniques, and prioritize quality over quantity. This created a sense of pride and craftsmanship that went far beyond mere work. It became a form of artistic expression and spiritual practice. But perhaps the most therapeutically significant aspect was how brewing connected these women to something larger than themselves. Every batch they produced would nourish their community and their neighbors. They weren't just making beer, they were creating sustenance, comfort, and even medicine, since many convent brews included healing herbs and spices. This sense of service and contribution provided what modern therapy calls purpose-driven meaning, the understanding that their daily activities had genuine positive impact on others' lives. The documentation from various medieval convents reveals that many nuns specifically requested to work in the brewery when they were struggling with personal challenges. The abbesses seemed to understand that brewing duty was particularly effective for helping sisters work through difficult periods. Some records even describe brewing as a form of penance, not as punishment, but as a healing practice that helped restore spiritual and emotional balance. Let's talk about the innovation that happened in these spaces because it reveals another therapeutic dimension. Medieval nuns weren't content to just follow traditional brewing recipes. They were constantly experimenting and improving their techniques. They developed new ways to incorporate medicinal herbs, created seasonal variations that reflected local ingredients, and shared innovations between different convents through their correspondence networks. This culture of experimentation and improvement created what we now recognize as essential therapeutic elements: intellectual stimulation, creative expression, and the confidence that comes from successful problem solving. The nuns were engaging in what modern therapy calls behavioral activation. pursuing meaningful activities that naturally combat depression and anxiety by building competence and providing positive reinforcement. The spiritual dimension of brewing therapy in medieval convents deserves special attention because it integrated faith with practical healing in ways that were surprisingly sophisticated. The nuns didn't see brewing as separate from their religious practice. They understood it as a form of prayer in action. They blessed their ingredients, said prayers during different stages of the process, and dedicated their finished products to divine service. This integration created what we might now call holistic therapy, addressing spiritual, psychological, and physical well-being simultaneously. The repetitive prayers that accompanied brewing tasks served as a form of meditative practice that reduced anxiety and promoted emotional regulation. The sense of divine partnership in their work provided hope and resilience during difficult periods. The understanding that their brewing was a form of service to God gave meaning and purpose to even the most mundane tasks. Here's something that really highlights the therapeutic sophistication of these practices. Many convents developed what we can only describe as brewing therapy intensives for sisters going through particularly challenging times. A nun dealing with grief, spiritual crisis, or physical illness might be assigned to spend extended time in the brewery, working closely with experienced sisters who could provide both practical instruction and emotional support. These intensive periods weren't just about keeping busy. They were carefully structured to provide increasing levels of responsibility and accomplishment. A sister might start by simply observing and assisting, then gradually take on more complex tasks as her confidence and stability returned. The brewery became a place where healing could happen at each individual's pace, supported by meaningful work and caring community. The seasonal festivals and celebrations that revolved around brewing created additional therapeutic opportunities. The blessing of the first batch of spring beer, harvest celebrations featuring special brews, and the sharing of holiday varieties all provided occasions for joy, gratitude, and community bonding. These events combated the isolation and despair that could easily overwhelm individuals living in closed communities, especially during difficult historical periods. Medieval record-keeping wasn't always systematic, but the accounts we have suggest that convents with active brewing programs had better overall mental health outcomes than those without. Sisters lived longer, reported fewer episodes of what we might now recognize as depression or anxiety, and maintained higher levels of community cooperation and spiritual satisfaction. The end of widespread convent brewing came gradually, influenced by changing social attitudes, economic pressures, and religious reforms that emphasized different forms of spiritual practice. But the therapeutic insights developed in these medieval breweries weren't entirely lost. They influenced later developments in occupational therapy, community mental health approaches, and even modern brewing therapy programs that are emerging today. Some contemporary therapeutic communities have actually studied medieval convent brewing practices to inform their own programs. The combination of meaningful work, sensory engagement, community support, and spiritual purpose that characterize convent brewing provides a model for holistic therapy that addresses multiple dimensions of human well-being simultaneously. What strikes me most about this hidden history is how these medieval nuns, working within the constraints of their time and place, developed therapeutic approaches that we're still trying to fully understand and implement today. They recognized the healing power of routine and structure, the importance of meaningful work, therapeutic value of sensory engagement, and the essential role of community support in mental health recovery. They understood that healing happens not just through talking or thinking, but through engaging the whole person, hands, heart, mind, and spirit in activities that create genuine value for others. They knew that therapy works best when it doesn't feel like therapy, when it's integrated into daily life as a natural source of purpose and connection. Perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that some of the most profound therapeutic interventions don't require expensive equipment, advanced degrees, or institutional settings. They require wisdom, compassion, and the understanding that healing happens through relationship, meaningful activity, and the patient cultivation of hope. The next time you raise a glass of craft beer, take a moment to appreciate not just the flavors and craftsmanship, but the ancient tradition of brewing as healing that connects you to countless generations of women who found in this sacred craft a path to wellness, community, and spiritual growth. Their legacy lives on in every thoughtful sip, every moment of brewing mindfulness, and every recognition that the most powerful therapies are often the ones that honor both our individual struggles and our profound need for connection with something larger than ourselves. These medieval nuns remind us that therapy isn't always found in clinical settings. Sometimes it's discovered in the patient tending of simple processes that connect us to our communities, our purposes, and our deepest sources of meaning.